Hi everyone, welcome to the In Conversation With series organised by SUSE Women in Tech. My name is Helen Smith, SUSE's Tax Director for EMEA and APJ, as well as a very proud member of the SUSE Women in Tech Network. Today I have the pleasure of hosting Jody O'Neill, an award-winning autistic writer and performer with over 20 years experience working in the theatre, film and TV in Ireland and internationally, and someone I consider a very good friend. Jody, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, excellent. So just to give you a little bit of context, Jody and I have known each other for a few years now. Our sons are in the same class at school, and we are both on the Parent Teachers Association at our school. So we've got to know each other quite well over the last few years. And but for everybody else's benefit, Jody, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became involved in the theatre?
Yeah, of course. So I was born in Dublin, but I grew up in Cove, which is an island at the south of Ireland. We moved there because my dad wanted to study to be a violin maker. So I'm the youngest in my family. I have two older brothers. And when we moved to Cove, my mum got involved in an amateur theatre company. And what was really cool about it was that it was on the naval base opposite Cove. So you had to take a boat in order to get there. And so we just had these trips to the theatre where you'd go across in this boat at, in the darkest night, and then walk to the theatre, arrive at the theatre, and this whole spectacle would begin. So I think that kind of gave me an initial love of theatre, and then, as I got a little bit older, I used to help her learn lines, and my passion, I suppose, really was more ballet than theatre at that time. But when I was 15, I auditioned for schools in the UK, and physically I just wasn't cut out to be a ballet dancer. So they were saying, well, you can come and you can study for 3 years, but you won't be walking by the end of it. And that was a huge blow at 15. Yeah. But around that time, I also joined a youth theatre. And I think youth theatre is just such a blessing for kids who don't necessarily fit the mold, because all the other kids who show up there also don't fit the mold. And so I had an amazing few years as a part of Activate Youth Theatre in Cork. And then on leaving school, I was kind of facing this dilemma. So I had left dance behind, and I was wondering, okay, well, I love genetics. Do I want to study genetics, or do I want to study theatre? And I've always had this tendency to find the things that I'm least good at doing and doing them until I start to get good at them. And so I chose theatre because I was really not a good actor at the time. And I thought, okay, well, you know what, I'll just find something really hard to do and keep at it until I can do it and I can start to make a career for myself. And then I suppose the move into writing came actually out of necessity, really. I spent a lot of my 20s waitressing, and I loved waitressing. And I worked in the kitchen a little bit, and so many of my good friends came from those years. But my last experience in the service industry was in this very strange cafe where the security cameras were always focused on the staff, and the owners would call you if they felt like your hair was out of place, or if they felt like your uniform was or if they didn't like the way you were standing. And at that point I was like, okay, it's time. I need to find something else. I know I'm not going to be one of those actors that's always going, job to job to job. So I need something for the in-between time. And similarly, my partner, Carl, was working a lot in pubs at that time, and he was finding that really hard going. So we went halves on a MacBook. We bought a MacBook, and he started to write music and I started to write plays. And that's kind of what we've been doing ever since. That was about 15 years ago, I guess.
Wow, that's incredible. So you picked the hard road every time, Jody, and quite different choices, genetics or theatre. It falls apart.
I know,
I'm sure you would have been
to go back to
it as well. Yeah. So late 2019, early 2020, you staged the play, you wrote and staged the play, What I Don't Know About Autism. So it's clearly a very important issue for you, very close to your heart. I've had the pleasure of seeing this incredible piece of work live, and we have a clip for everyone to view now to give you a little taste of Jody's work. So Jenny, could you please play the video clip for us?
This is the history of autism. going to do it anyway.
Possibly autistic, possibly autistic, possibly autistic. Do-do-do-do, how-do-do-do.
Sir Isaac Newton,
Albert Einstein.
Nikola Tesla, ahead of his time.
Michelangelo,
Emily Dickinson,
Hans Christian Andersen, and Charles Darwin. The biologists behind evolution. So let's fast forward to the 1940s, a weird time for those with disabilities. Lock them up in an institution, or even worse, a eugenic solution. Autism was known as childhood schizophrenia, a condition you'd outgrow. About media.
Enter stage right, Dr. Leo Kanner, having left Germany for the Star Spangled Banner.
in 1943, he published his paper
On 11 boys and girls, their autistic behavior.
He borrowed the term from another physician,
But he was the first to call it a condition.
but that's not all that Leo did.
He said the kids' challenges, emotional and others, were all because of their refrigerator mothers.
For all because of their refrigerator mother.
Were all because of their refrigerator mothers.
Like I said, I was lucky enough to see this live, and it was absolutely fantastic. It was so emotive, so informative, and it was wonderful. So can you walk me through the process of the inspiration behind the play? You know, what made you want to write this piece?
Yeah, of course. So in October 2016, my son was diagnosed with autism, and we were given a bunch of recommendations by the clinicians who diagnosed him, and they were largely around get him into really intensive therapy for 20 to 30 hours a week, whatever you can afford, and see if you can turn him into a typical person. And I think you're really vulnerable as a parent at that time, because you just go, okay, well, I've been wondering about this for a while. Now I have an answer. Now somebody's telling me what to do, so I better go and do it. And what happened in our case was that we did look for a therapist, and we came up short. And so I started to study these particular therapies that had been recommended, and they weren't quite a comfortable fit for our family. And we broadened the search a little bit, and kind of my partner really started to happen upon videos or nuggets of information or books that were written by members of the autistic community. And what we realized was that adults who were autistic were saying quite different things and making quite different recommendations about what would have worked for them when they were children. But it really resonated with us. It resonated with how we live our lives, how we value people, how we value their individuality. And really, I suppose, ultimately for us, we didn't want to change our son because we loved him. We wanted him to, have a little help with anxiety, which is a huge part of being autistic. But we didn't want to turn him into a different person. We didn't want to take the autism away because we felt it's a fundamental part of who he is. And so, as parents, I suppose our parenting evolved, and we were learning, but also as an artist, I was looking around and going, okay, well, why is it that parents are being told, change your child, fix your child? Why is that the first thing that people are hearing? And maybe should we be looking at changing that? And obviously I'm not a clinician. I didn't go down the genetics route, and I'm not a politician, but I did think, okay, well, there's so much really rich material here. Maybe I'm going to look at writing a play. And I didn't set out to write what I don't know about autism. I was going to write this futuristic piece about a world where genetic anomalies had been wiped out, but also innovation had come to a complete standstill. But then but I wanted it to be really well researched, but actually the research was so much more interesting than this fictional play that I was thinking about writing, that I started to make notes of scenes, and all of a sudden, after 4 or 5 months, I had 26 scenes, and each of them look at a different aspect of autism. And I kind of physically laid them out one day in where I was working at the time, and went, oh, look, I actually have this play now, and maybe we should read it, see what it sounds like. And in terms of the development process, so that was really organic in terms of the writing process for me. And then similarly, the development process was really organic. So I met a woman to speak about her work, writing her thesis about relaxed performance for university. And because my feeling was that if I was going to write something about autism, then in keeping with the disability maxim, nothing about us without us, A, I wanted autistic people to be there, and B, I wanted autistic people to be in the cast. So I wanted to create both a relaxed rehearsal environment and a relaxed performance environment. And so I met this woman who had written her thesis in this area. And at the end of the cup of tea, I was like, you know, I think that I'd love to work with you. And if I write this play, would you like to be in it? And so that's Eleanor, who you saw in the video there.
Yeah.
And similarly, other people came on board in those ways. So yeah, I guess ultimately we made this scene. It's 26 scenes. It's a relaxed performance. So at the very beginning, the first thing all the actors do is come out on stage and explain to the audience that it is a relaxed performance and that the rules, normal kind of invisible rules about theatre etiquette don't apply. So if people need to leave the auditorium during the performance, that's fine. If they want to come back in, that's fine too. If they need to move around during the performance, that's also fine with us. And also to let them know that we would warn about any content that might be distressing, but also warn about noises or sudden lighting changes so that people who have sensory processing differences could be comfortable in the theatre, because I think we don't realize we're so used to things like clapping, for example, which can be so distressing to some people who have sensory processing differences. And I think when you start to examine them and unpick them a little bit, you go, oh, we just do that out of habit. There's actually no need necessarily for us to do that. And it's acting as a barrier to people accessing an arts and a cultural experience. So all through the development process, we were constantly questioning, is this the right decision? Is this going to make people feel at home? Is it going to ruin the drama of the play if we tell them what's going to happen? And I don't think it did. And I think actually what happened was that, I mean, I didn't have anybody come and say, oh, I was uncomfortable in that theatre experience. I think making it accessible for autistic people actually made it more accessible for everybody.
I would agree. Having actually, watched the performance live, I did not feel it was in any way detracted from a typical theatre experience. The lights were ever so slightly up. You could see everything. I loved the format on stage with the where you listed out all the scenes, and that was excellent. So everybody knew what was going on, really well informed. And then the kind of chats with you at the end, where you sat and answered questions at various points throughout the performance as well, was like a really unique touch, and people really did engage with it actually as well. So it was just so refreshing. And I mean, we talked about in relation to the relaxed performance, this was quite significant, wasn't it? Because it's not, it was the first time that it had been done in the theatres in Ireland for adults, I mean.
Yeah, so there have been relaxed performances. They've been relaxed performances for children mainly. The Abbey Theatre, which is our national theatre, had never had a relaxed performance for anybody before What I Don't Know About Autism. So that was amazing because, we were funded by the Arts Council, but we were funded as a sort of a project award. But what happened was that when the Abbey came on board, and we had two other production partners as well, the Mermaid in County Wicklow and the Everyman in Cork. But because the Abbey is the national theatre, they can bring resources to it that we wouldn't have had by ourselves. And they were so behind it, because obviously there's a difference between somebody going, okay, well, that's going to look really good on my funding application next year because we did a relaxed performance. But they were behind it every step of the way. And similarly, how we ran our tech process, the run up to production, where we're kind of getting ready and we're running with lights and sound and practicing. We had adapted that process to suit the sensory needs of the actors, so that the actors wouldn't be left on stage under bright lights, really hot for too long.
Yeah.
And there were different factors that we brought in, and what the Abbey said was that really they were going to probably take some of that and use it in every future production. So that was lovely, and like you say, that engagement with the audience was amazing, because I think what we realized really early on in the development was that people just desperately wanted to talk. And they wanted to talk about disability, and they wanted to talk about autism, and they wanted to talk to autistic people. And so I set up the show with those 2 question time scenes in it, and it was kind of just a test. And we didn't know the first time we tried it what would happen, and we didn't have the timer, so that giant egg timer that you saw, Helen, we didn't have the first showing in Mermaid. So we did the showing in Mermaid, and we said, like, we kind of thought, okay, maybe one person is going to ask a question, or maybe we just move on with the show. 45 minutes later, we were like, so we just have to do the rest of the play now.
Still have a few more scenes. Okay.
So we had to bring in that premise of, okay, the question time scenes, there are 2 of them, they're 2 minutes each, they're self-contained, but we have that 20 minutes at the end of the show where we can sit down and talk to the audience. And that was an amazing experience for us as well, because people were so honest and so engaged. And, you know, there would be the talk back, and then people would kind of wander onto the stage afterwards for another kind of chat. So it was lovely that it worked, but it was a big risk, and also a risk in putting the actors out there, and how they were so gracious and so generous in sitting on that stage every night and answering people's questions, you know, straight from the heart, which were very particular and a very talented and giving bunch of human beings that we worked with.
Yeah, they're fantastic. It was really wonderful. What was the feedback from well, both your communities, and the theatre community, and as well as the autistic community? What was the feedback overall from the play?
Yeah, so it was, you know, there are those kind of projects that, you know, you struggle along with, and you're kind of teasing it together every point of the way, and this was kind of the opposite to that. So it was just one of those projects where, as soon as I kind of hit on the idea, a theatre company offered me space to write in, which makes a big difference for me because I'm very unfocused when I'm working from home. And so I wrote most of the play in their offices. And then any funding application that I put in, people were on board with it straight away. And maybe that was to do with so the idea was always very clear. It was A, to write a play that promoted autism acceptance, but B, also make a play that celebrates autistic identity. And I think when your message is clear, that always really helps. So, you know, all the actors that we asked, all the designers that we approached, it was a yes from everybody. And like I say, the Abbey were amazing in how they supported it, and same with Mermaid and the Everyman. So it felt like a project that kind of had its own momentum. But obviously, during the whole process and during the research process, I was also discovering my own autistic identity, because I hadn't been diagnosed until June of 2019. So this project was well in process by that point. And so it was a funny one for me, because I was kind of learning to realign myself, yes, as an artist, and yes, as a creator, but also as an autistic person within this kind of very tight community that I've been a part of for a long time as a supposedly not autistic person. So it was really interesting, and nobody didn't embrace it, and I didn't I didn't get any negative responses to it, but it was a sort of a strange moment of repositioning for me. And then in terms of the autistic community, we were very careful with how we made the show. We made it always in conversation with the autistic community. And I have to say that in general, people were just generous, happy for it to be happening, to be really, really giving with suggestions, and spoke to, you know, really feeling represented in a theatre for the first time. So that was a really important outcome for us. But at each point in the development, we would invite people along, and also, you know, simple things like when we were working with the graphic designer on the poster, we would send the design we would share it in this social network for autistic people in Ireland. I would share the design, and people would give their input. Or when we were deciding, so one of the things that we did was we captioned the show, but I didn't know at the beginning whether captioning the show would interfere with some people's sensory experiences. So for one person, they might have audio processing differences and they need to read the text. But for another person who has visual processing differences, the text could be really distracting. So we essentially kind of had a vote on this autistic forum, and they very strongly in favor of captioning. But I think I really think as long as people feel included in a conversation and as long as they feel considered, you're probably not going to have huge negative pushback.
Yeah, it's excellent. Such an inclusive process from start to finish, and then opening the door for, you know, future inclusivity with other performances. And, you know, we've discussed before how a lot of people don't necessarily want to go to the theatre or to a gallery or, you know, to a lot of events because it can be overstimulating and it can just all be a bit too much. So, you know, creating this from start to finish with that in mind was, you know, absolutely wonderful and beneficial to so many. I hadn't appreciated that you were going through your own diagnosis as you wrote the play. So with, you know, you were diagnosed as an adult and not as a child. How did you reflect on your past when you received the diagnosis? You know, was there anything you kind of thought, aha, you know, a realization?
Yeah, so those things are still happening every day. It's amazing. It's been an amazing thing for me. It's been very empowering, because, you know, for example, 2-3 years ago, if you would have asked me to do a conversation like this, I would have said, no, I can't do that. I don't have those skills. But now I have a better sense of what I need to put in place in order to bolster myself, in order to do these things. So it's not actually that, okay, that's not accessible to me. But I have a I understand better how my mind works now, and I understand what I need to put in place in order to make a situation work for me. And so I'm a little bit more judicious in how I choose what I do and how I spend my time. That's a very empowering position to be in. But I mean, there are so many aha moments, but one of them was, I was thinking about it recently. So a lot of autistic people are not comfortable making direct eye contact. And I didn't even realize for a long, long time that I didn't necessarily make direct eye contact and that I might look slightly off to the left or slightly, you know, towards the middle of somebody's forehead. But how I discovered that was I was on a set filming a TV series and I had a scene with the actor Aidan Gillen. And we were filming it and we had done a couple of takes and we were going to do my close-up and the director came over. This was back in 2014 or 2015. The director came over and he was like, why are you not looking at Aidan in the eye? And because he was so close up, he could see that I was doing this little trick of looking off. I had no idea what I was doing because I was so used to doing it, so used to just doing that in practice. Until somebody kind of forensically analyzed the kind of measurements on camera and how they were getting their focus. Nobody would have picked up on it. That was a really funny moment when I look back on that and went, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. And now I get why I wasn't doing that. But yeah, you know, there are tons of things I suppose I see about, you know, the way I grew up or how I understood the world or how I misinterpreted the world. So like a very simple example was that when I was a child, I used to go places with my mum, but I would have a huge level of anxiety about it. And we did a tour of Photo House, which is this very grand house in Cove when I was 5 or 6. And the guide came out and she said, okay, everyone, you're very welcome. Now, as we have a very big group today, we're going to split you all in two. And so I spent the whole of the next hour wondering whether she was going to like split us down this way or she was this way. Or so I had this kind of literal understanding of language. And I suppose one of the misconceptions about autistic people is that they remain literal. But actually, I think autistic people have a really rich relationship with language. So yeah, we might have that literal thing, but you know, once you understand it, so like I spend a lot of time with my son talking about phrases and non-literal phrases, and now sometimes he says to me, he's like, oh, for goodness sake, that's not a literal phrase, it's metaphorical. So he's really good at picking them up now. So it's just maybe sometimes that we need a little bit more awareness in those areas, a little bit more explanation.
There's so many expressions and phrases are so confusing, and like you can see how that example proves exactly, you know, what it can mean to somebody else, you know. And wow. Can I ask you a little bit about labels and terminology? And what is the right way or the most respectful way to address the autistic community or an individual?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And interestingly, I was just reflecting back on this. Initially, when I was starting my research for the project, I did send out questionnaires to autistic parents of autistic kids, but also to self-advocates. And in the self-advocates questionnaire, one of the things I asked was whether people preferred person first language or identity first language. Because we had been told by the therapist that we have to say somebody with autism as opposed to somebody autistic, because somebody might take offense to being called autistic, and that it was more polite. But actually, it kind of came down quite heavily from the autistic community that people generally prefer identity first language. And I think part of that is that, you know, if you think about autism, it's not something a child is going to grow out of. It's not something that's going to leave them as their life goes on. So, for example, you say person with COVID-19, because COVID-19 is a temporary part of their life. But with autism can imply that the autism is somehow separable from the person. And there's this, you know, there's this horrible myth, you know, that if you could just take the autism away, you'd be left with a normal person. But if you took the autism away, you would be left with a completely different person. So for that reason, I like the identity first language. I think the most respectful form of language to use is what you hear that person using about themselves. And if you haven't managed to hear that, then it's always, I can't imagine ever being offended by somebody saying, what's your preference? Because not every autistic person prefers being called autistic. Some autistic people do prefer, you know, person first language. And I suppose another interesting facet of that debate is the idea of, I don't know if you've come across the social model of disability, Helen, but it's this idea that developed in the 70s and 80s that people are not innately disabled, but it is the fact that they're living in a world not built to fit their needs that disables them. So, you know, a person with a disability kind of sounds like they're carrying this disability around with them, but actually, you know, if we didn't build steps, a wheelchair user would not necessarily be disabled. So that it's actually an external factor, which is our social constructs and the fact that we build our world without factoring in quite a large critical mass of people that disables people. So it's a huge debate around labels, and I can't give you a definitive answer because there just isn't one. But I would say I would come down really strongly, and most of the autistic people I know would come down really strongly on the side of identity first, because yeah, we see it as an inseparable part of ourselves. But again, I think don't be afraid to ask the questions.
Should we use neurodiverse and neurotypical? Are they good examples of language to use in a wider context?
I think they are. You know, I mean, the word neurotypical started out as a joke, where somebody, where an autistic writer, I think is Laura. I've her second name has evaded me. Tisson, maybe, where she was sort of trying to flag up how people with differences are treated. So she wrote this paper where she referred to, you know, typically developing people as neurotypical, to kind of, you know, flip that sort of pathologization of people with differences. But it kind of just really connected, I think, with the community, and it's connected over time. But it's good to remember that neurodivergence is a huge umbrella. So under neurodivergence comes autism, yes, and comes ADHD and dyslexia and dyspraxia and dyscalculia and a whole spectrum of different ways of thinking. And I think it's fantastic, because I think the word diverse is generous and it doesn't say anything wrong. It just says this is the reality of living as a human being, is that not all of us, not all of our brains work the same way. So so definitely I think neurodiversity and versus neurotypical is great. I suppose sometimes what happens is people use neurodivergent or neurotypical as the opposite of autistic, whereas maybe the opposite of autistic is more allistic is the word for non-autistic.
Okay, so the neurodivergence umbrella, that's basically accepting all of our differences. It's accepting everything without any sense of deficit or, you know, less than feel to it with the language. I think is really important. Really important to take that forward.
Yeah, it is, and it kind of creates the idea of a whole landscape of being and existence, which I think is much more helpful and much more fruitful than, you know, saying, okay, well, you're in this box over here, but you're over here, and actually, and there's something wrong with all of you. But rather than going that, it's just that these people have different strengths and different challenges too. But we do all have challenges, and some people, you know, it's I think a lot of the time we can kind of just by putting a very straight label on somebody, we can kind of write them off. Whereas I think the notion of neurodivergence doesn't limit people's capability and capacity to make a meaningful contribution to the world.
Excellent. So you received your diagnosis as an adult, as we've discussed. Statistically, boys are diagnosed more so than girls. Why do you think this is?
So I think there are a few reasons for this, and I've been thinking about it quite a lot recently because I have a project I'm working on at the moment that focuses specifically more on female autism. So I think one of the main issues is that the assessments and criteria under which people are diagnosed are based on a male white presentation of autism. So when I went to seek a diagnosis, I was quite shocked at how male biased that whole diagnostic process was, and how I kind of had to funnel my experience as a woman through this lens of male autism and whether I actually sort of, you know, met the mark. And I think there's also been a certain amount of damage done by this notion of, which is Simon Baron-Cohen's idea around, and I think he's kind of he's rode back a lot on this in recent years, but the idea of the extreme male brain. And I think that's done an awful lot of damage to the idea of, you know, being feminine and being autistic. And then, of course, there is this idea, and I think there's a certain amount of truth in this, but that women are better at masking and mimicking. So, you know, so how I got through my childhood was I would find really, you know, I'd focus in on having one really good friend. And normally that really good friend would be somebody who was a little bit more extrovert than I was, a little bit more clued in, could sort of untangle these non-literal phrases for me, and I could navigate the world through them. And bizarrely, in my case, all of them were called Katie. So I had like a primary school Katie, secondary school Katie, ballet, and then when I went to college and started working in a restaurant, I found a new Katie, and she's still
another Katie.
But what happens is I would mimic their traits. So I would, you know, for example, my secondary school Katie had an English accent, so suddenly I was saying, you know, scone and yogurt, and because I felt this profound need to just be somebody who I wasn't, because I had gotten so used to and so conditioned to mimicking other people that I had kind of left myself behind somewhere, you know, back in when I was 3 or 4. And so I think there's this idea that, you know, that women mask, and they do mask, and they sometimes do it very, very successfully. But I think that's not an excuse for not diagnosing women and girls. And I think we have to start looking in different areas. So, you know, some of the recent research around, you know, that maybe up to 1 in 5 women or young girls presenting with an eating disorder actually also meet the criteria for being diagnosed with autism. So maybe we have to look at a different kind of group of traits that are specifically female. Because I think what's happened is that there's this danger of misdiagnosing. So somebody is treated for an eating disorder when actually the eating disorder is actually kind of a manifestation of them being autistic. And people can get diagnosed with multiple personality disorder and depression, and yes, you know, there can be mental health challenges that come as a result of sort of keeping up this mask of being a typical person in a world that's built for typical needs and trying to, but I think it can leave people with a profound sense of failure, which is really dangerous. And I think I just think we could do a lot better. You know, I see young girls sometimes and they're struggling, but they're also somehow more conditioned, you know, to be good. And we still have that idea of, you know, if a girl is, you know, that if a boy is being mischievous, it's like, oh, sure, you know, boys will be boys. That really is still a thing. Whereas girls, it's, you know, oh, you know, be a good girl and be kind and be generous. We nurture these traits, and rightly so. We should be nurturing kindness, you know, across, you know, all gender identities. Of course, we should. But I think I see, you know, girls sometimes who are struggling and who perhaps haven't or won't be diagnosed because they're better people pleasers and they're trying hard to please. And so in a sense, you know, we still have all these systems that are based around compliance and the idea of compliance. And I think that can be really damaging to people who maybe actually could do with help or could do with an explanation for why they are the way they are, why they feel the way they feel within the world.
I can only imagine how stressful it must be, that feeling of having to conform, and you know how damaging it is long term, and just generally exhausting day in day out, feeling the need to fit in and to meet an expectation, and when it's another set of criteria that's really at play and needs to be addressed, you know, and would make all the difference. It's just it's heartbreaking. Can I ask, what are the key differences between male and female autism? How does it present differently?
So sometimes it doesn't. And, you know, I think what's always really important to bear in mind is that one autistic person is one autistic person. So you're not going to get a general, you know, this is
to go through,
it's a binary experience.
Of course.
But so there would always be, you know, so maybe that people would manifest different socially or behave different socially than a typically developing child or young person or adult, and that they might struggle. Now, people say it's to do with the idea of imagination, and that autistic, and that's one of the really destructive myths, is that autistic people don't have imagination, but it's to do with the idea of kind of social imagination. So for me, for example, it's really difficult. Like a lot of the time I might get an invite to a party and I'll be like, yes, I would love to come to your party. And then I start to think about, oh, okay, so there's no script for the party. I don't know what the house looks like that I'm going to. I don't know exactly who's going to be there. I don't know the conversations that I'm going to have. I can't predict this and I can't predict that. So I suppose that's sort of an anxiety, but also a kind of a struggle to get a sense of myself within that situation and how that's going to be. So what invariably would be happening is that by the time it's the night before the party, I'm like, okay, I need an excuse not to go to the party now. So I'm going to come so a reason not to go. And I think so I don't. Whereas actually, you know, I think, you know, my son would just go, I'm not going to that party. I'm not going, and because. Yeah, but I think, and also that's to do with aging and experience and all that realm of stuff. And I suppose you might see, I don't want to kind of get into sort of stereotyping how different teachers would experience something, but I would see my son uncomfortable in a situation, and I would know that I would have been uncomfortable in that situation as a child, but he will tell me that he's uncomfortable, or his behavior will tell me that he's uncomfortable, whereas I might have kind of found under the bed. So, and that's, you know, that's also to do with my life experience of growing up with two older brothers. So there's a little bit more expectation to toe the line and just get on with it. But I think, yeah, I find that a lot of the males that I know who would have been diagnosed as autistic, they would have been more vocal about their experiences early on. Whereas a lot of the females that I know, and I think it's quite a common experience, that women get diagnosed when they become mothers. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it's just to do with the fact that maybe was diagnosed as neurodivergent. I think it's also to do with, well, up until that point, I had complete control over my life and how I lived it and who I was. But then, and I had, like, you know, put on these layers of conformity, but a little person enters your life and they have no will to conform and they have no will to mask. And so suddenly I was finding myself quite kind of burnt out in a way from going, I don't know how to both be the right mother for this person and live with all the layers of sort of hiding that I've built up over the years. And I think that's, for me, why I really felt like it would be important to go and seek a diagnosis, was to go and just acknowledge, well, yeah, this is my experience. This is what I've spent 40 years covering up. And now I just have to kind of start peeling back the layers and see what's at the
Oh, wow. Can we talk a little bit about education as well? Currently, the system is very much sort of one size fits all. How does this impact our youth, and kind of what can we do to, you know, make a shift, make way, make some room?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the late Ken Robinson's work, Helen, but, you know, he would have talked a lot about the need to move from an industrial model of education to an agricultural model. And, you know, not agriculture as we might do it, mass producing stuff now, but an organic model of agriculture where each mind gets the food it needs in order to develop. And that is across the spectrum. Every human has specific, everybody should have an IEP, everyone should have an individualized education program. I think there are two challenges. I think there's the fact that we're still segregating children with additional needs and disabilities. And I think that by doing that, we're limiting their chances in the adult world. So I think by saying, well, we can let these children into the classroom because they're okay in mainstream, but these children have to go to a special school. I think we're doing those people a great disservice, because we're setting them up for a lifetime of institutionalization, because they're not developing the network, they're not developing they're not getting nourished in the way they need to be nourished. And, you know, we push, and special education then becomes this kind of one size fits all within special education. So, you know, people are coming out the other end and they're maybe not able to read, or, you know, I know a woman whose daughter had very complex physical care needs, but no different cognitive needs at the age of 5, was forced to go to a special school. Year after year, her mom talks about getting the same painting, you know, the handprint, and the handprint is getting bigger each year for 15 years, but no cognitive development. She's watching her daughter fall behind. But now the amazing part of the story is that her daughter's out the other end. She's in UCD. She's doing a program of modules. She's discovering that she loves Art Deco and that she loves fashion and that she's going to start a blog. And, you know, so we need to stop looking at people and saying what they are and saying, you get this because this is who you are and that's what your life is worth, because there are multiple types of intelligence and we need to nurture each type. And I suppose that within our education system here anyway, children are expected to move very fast through a very broad range of subjects. And that's not always something that an autistic person is capable of doing. And I think we need to look at how we nourish the minds of, we need multitaskers, we need these minds that can do that and can get through the system fast. But we also need to look at, okay, how do we stimulate deeper thinkers? How do we stimulate the people who can, get deep into a system, analyze it, pull it apart, visualize what it could be and reinvent it? Because, a lot of those people are going to be the people who change the world, but if we don't educate them properly, they won't get the chance.
Such a missed opportunity. I mean, we need all these minds. We need them all switched on, doing all the different things. And yeah, I think there's a huge way to go in the education system to make that happen. Quite personal to us at the moment, Jody. So I've got a couple more questions for you, but I'm also conscious of time and that we will want to allow questions from the audience as well. But I do really want to ask about what can we do in a working environment to be more inclusive for the autistic community, or anyone that needs some other kinds of support. What can we offer? What can we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, doing an event like this is a good idea, where you really consult with people who have lived experience. I think obviously not making assumptions is really important. So don't assume that, because this autistic person needed this, that will be the same for somebody else. So yeah. I think if somebody discloses, and I think, we could work to make it okay for people to disclose if they have an invisible disability. Then it's about really asking what they think they need, because generally the individual is best positioned to advocate for themselves and their needs. However, that said, sometimes people don't know because they've never been accommodated. So reasonable accommodations have never been made. And so it's worth looking at, doing a little bit of research around, okay, what accommodations can we offer that this person can kind of, tick off the list? Okay, yes, lower lighting would help me. No, I don't work well in an open plan office, or yes, I do work well in an open plan office. I won't be good at breaks, I'll need support in that area. I think, and around recruitment and training, what would really help me, I've been in work situations where I've gone like 3 years without ever going to the kitchen because nobody showed me where it was. So because I have no reference for that kitchen, I'm like, oh, well, I just don't go to the kitchen. And the kitchen is only downstairs. I could go and look, but there's something in me that doesn't let me do it. So I think being aware that, when you're training new staff, when we do get back into our offices, that can really help are developing visual guides so that somebody knows in advance on their first day, that you've sent them, okay, these are your team, these are the pictures of your team, so you'll recognize these, you can this is the office where you're working, this is where the kitchen is, and also maybe, that if it helps somebody to kind of have not exactly a buddy system, but somebody who's really kind of, does take the time to not make assumptions and go, okay, what would I have needed on my first day? What would have made me feel better? Because we're all nervous on our first days. And so what would help me in advance? And I think bearing in mind basic things like people needing extra processing time. So don't like have a meeting and then throw everything at the person. I tend to need, so if somebody throws something at me in a meeting, I'll be like, no, we're not doing that. But if they let me know, however, like in person or by email, 24 hours before, then I have loads of time to process it, and I will come around to, yeah, I get that. I can really embrace that. I can really get on board with it. So I think it's worth doing a little bit of thinking generally, and maybe, I came across recently the Pushkin Museum in Moscow did a sensory audit of their building. So, but if you, and it sounds like a really complex thing, but actually they just invited in a lot of stakeholders. So a lot of autistic people, a lot of clinicians, a lot of people with sensory processing differences. And they asked them questions and asked them about their experiences. And then they kind of analyzed, okay, so this room is problematic because of the colors of the walls. This room is difficult because of the acoustics. And if you can kind of start to identify that, then you kind of can predict some of the stuff that might come up.
Okay. Wow. That's so helpful, Jody. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to hand across to Jenny now to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Yes, and thank you, Jody and Helen. We've had a lot of questions, so I'm going to get straight into it. So the play has sparked a lot of interest, so I'm going to fire your first question on that. And it's, when casting for the play, how important was it for you to find actors that could authentically portray the characters? And for example, were all of the actors autistic?
That's a great question. So not all the actors were autistic. It was always my idea to write something that was autistic people and non-autistic people working together. And it was really important for me to have authentic autistic experience in the room, because I think we, in general, the arts gets that wrong so often. What was interesting in terms of the casting process was that I was like, okay, how are we going to audition? How are we going to get the right people on board? And actually, they just all showed up. So out of those questionnaires that I had sent out, I got an email from a young man who was saying, so my mom filled out your questionnaire and she says you're doing a play and I'm an actor and would you like to audition me? That was 18 months before we did the play, but we did audition him and he was fantastic. And so we cast him. I think, so I guess in terms of, it was important that people would be able to authentically portray characters, but also this is a play where there are 26 scenes and there are multiple characters. So everybody plays non-autistic people, everybody plays autistic people at some point during the play, or not necessarily autistic people, but it was really important that the characters that sort of do drive the narrative, there are some characters that come back and have a sort of a narrative story throughout the play, that they would always be played by autistic performers. And we just found a phenomenally talented bunch of people who just surpassed our expectations every single day in rehearsals and performances.
Lovely, thank you, Jody. And what was the most challenging and rewarding part of the creative process in putting together the play?
The most challenging thing was that you were never going to create a play that represented every single aspect of autism and every single person's experience. So one of the big things that I remember are two audience questions during the process, which was, one was around the lack of LGBTQ plus experience in the play, and the other one was around the absence of people of colour from the production. And that's a really specific intersectional experience that really needs investigation, and that my play didn't do. And I'm not the only person who's going to write a play about autism. There are going to be other people writing plays, and I know that, but I feel a responsibility now on future projects to address those two areas, and to do so, with key stakeholders, and say, okay, well, what are the issues and what do we need to put on stage? So that was the that's probably the challenging part, is that you can't represent everything with one play, and that it was really just the start of a conversation. And the other challenging thing is that COVID happened and there's been no theatre, so we're still waiting for the show to come back, which it will do in the autumn, and it'll be live streamed, so people will have a chance to see it, and we'll also have live performances. But the kind of waiting has been tough, I think, on the cast. And I suppose the rewarding thing was just that it was the best fun. And I've never been in a rehearsal room where there was so much spontaneous creativity and laughter and freedom and just a huge generosity of spirit towards each other. And also that it had a profound impact on people. So we would get emails from people saying, I'm not going to stop my child stimming in public anymore because now I understand that it's important, or I'm going to be a slightly different teacher because I now understand something deeper about autistic children and their needs, and that their needs are, because I think there's this idea about that, oh, well, children act up, or they exaggerate, or they put on something. But I think to show people through the experience of spending time with autistic people in a theatre, it was a really powerful teaching tool, without us having to be like, okay, I'm just going to bang you over the head with my stick and get this into your brain. We didn't have to try it. Just through experience, people really engaged, and I think it changed people, and that was fantastic. And also people like then going and seeking diagnoses off the back of it, going, yes, now I see myself, now I see why my life has been like this, and seeking a diagnosis afterwards.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that, Jody. And you actually answered one of the next questions, which is, can we see the production virtually? But you mentioned that you'll be doing live streaming when you're post-COVID and back in production. So that's really going to go down well with the audience. And I'm conscious of time, so just quickly before we hand back to Helen to just wrap us up, what from your life experiences would you give in terms of advice to your younger self, and is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would, you know, not have so much fear, and not have, I would spend a lot less time learning how to be like everybody else, and a lot more time on just, you know, there's this idea that I kind of went around for 39 years as sort of a failed neurotypical person, when I could have been actually a really good autistic person if I had known who I was and what I needed. And I suppose as a parent, you know, if we had known from the beginning that I was autistic, then we kind of would have expected it more. So wouldn't have spent any time comparing my child and their development to someone else's child. And I wouldn't have spent so much time and so much money on parenting books and on sleep solution books. And I wouldn't have spent time Googling eye contact, or, you know, I think I would have worried less, and I would have trusted more. And both in relation to myself and my son, I think I would have spent less time, you know, measuring up progress and measuring out success or failure in a particular way. And I try now not to think of progress as a day-to-day thing, or as a week-to-week thing, but maybe, and only just maybe, you know, you take one day of a year and you look back to what it was like this day last year, and then you kind of begin to, progress is the wrong word, development, I think.
Lovely. Thank you, Jody. As we're almost out of time, I'm just going to hand back to you, Helen, for the final word.
Okay, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today, Jody. You've shared so much with us, being so very candid and open. We appreciate it very much. So many things for us to consider and take forward in the workplace, and you know, if we can all just move a little bit and celebrate all of our differences, I think that will make a huge difference going forward. But thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Okay, thanks everyone, and see you next time.